right, as we're waiting for our attendees to get signed on, I'll go ahead and get started so we can get right into our conversation today. Welcome everybody to our June Global Sport Matters live show, where we bring together experts to discuss issues that matter in the world of sport. We do want to take a moment to recognize Juneteenth, which was just signed into a federal holiday. And along with that acknowledgement, we always like to acknowledge that the lands where Global Sport Institute and Arizona State University sit belong to the Maricopa and Pima peoples. This conversation today is actually a part of our June digital issue, Beyond the Binary in Sport, which explores the spectra of sex, gender, and sexuality that challenge our traditional understanding of sport and competition. At the end of today's show, stick around for a video that we will be sharing on the research from the Global Sport Institute on our academic theme, which is sex, gender, and sexuality in sport. Inside of the issue, which is in the chat box here for you all to peruse, we have a lot of really great stories and stories that will be coming out. Our launch includes a national poll which shows the public's honest lack of certainty and consensus when it comes to transgender athletes participating in sport. We also have investigative journalist Jessica Luther sharing wisdom that she's gained from covering high-profile gender violence cases in college and professional sports. And from our host, Luke Brenneman, who is obviously our host today, we have an autoethnographic essay on delayed puberty. We also wanted to let you know that our newest podcast from the Global Sport Matters podcast, which you can subscribe to wherever you listen, we are excited that we have guest producer and host Karen Given, formerly of WBUR's Only a Game. She is actually releasing 2 episodes in a 2-part series with us. So part 1 is up. And these episodes are really examining the lived experience of transgender athletes, not only their experiences, but also looking at the legislation and the activism that we are seeing today. We are also gathering audio stories from our listeners and viewers like you. So this month, we would love for you to share your story about belonging in sport. And it's very easy to do. In the chat box, we are dropping a link. But in order to share your story, you just go ahead and click on that link. There are instructions and prompts on how to record, but it's very simple. You just click a button, and from there, you can record your story. It gets sent to us. And with your permission, we always love to share these with the wider public. So this is an opportunity for us to hear from you, a fan, an athlete, wherever you fit within sport, we would love to hear your story. So on to today's show, we are very, very excited to have our guests with us today. First up, I would love to introduce Don Mcpherson, former NFL and CFL quarterback and author of You Throw Like a Girl, The Blind Spot of Masculinity. We also have Erica Rand, professor of art and visual culture and gender and sexuality studies at Bates College. Chris Kluwe, former NFL player for the Minnesota Vikings, an outspoken advocate for gender equality. And he also has his newest debut novel, Otaku. So we will be dropping all of these links for you to continue following and finding all sorts of knowledge from our wonderful panel. We also have Paulette Stevenson, residential faculty at Mesa Community College, who received her doctorate in rhetoric, writing, and literacies, as well as a gender studies certificate from Arizona State University. And we also have Stan Thangaraj, associate professor of anthropology at the City College of New York, who examines stereotypes associated with race, gender, and sport. And I would also like to just take a moment to introduce our host, Luke Brenneman, our postdoc researcher at the Global Sport Institute. And during the discussion, before I turn it over to you, Luke, we always love to hear from our audience. So if you have questions or comments, just utilize the Q&A box below. It's just that button that says Q&A, open it on up, and please send us all of your questions and comments to share with the audience as well as our panelists. And with that, Luke, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Kendall. So I echo everything Kendall said about our panelists, about our topic. I'm just going to kind of give a brief kind of preview of what we're going to talk about, and then we're just going to dive right into a conversation. And this will be a conversation. It's not going to be coming back to me every time. We're gonna just kind of talk about it. And I do have some talking points, but we're just going to try to make sure that it flows as it flows, and we really hear what you all have to say. All right, so we're going to start with a segment that is kind of like defining and diagnosing toxic masculinity in sport, maybe separating toxic from masculinity and thinking about what that might look like, and maybe talking about some of the consequences of toxic masculinity for everyone, not just the people we might think of right away. And then we'll move into something that's more kind of like, how do we detoxify? So we've talked about the toxic nature. How do we kind of extract that and get rid of it? How do we move forward with a type of masculinity in sport, or maybe some alternative notion that somebody has for us today that can help us to kind of engage in sport differently in a better way moving forward? All right, so that's our trajectory. I'm going to start with a question that kind of sets the foundation a little bit. So what are some examples of toxic masculinity in sport? How do we see it? How can we identify it? And Don, I'm going to start with you on this one, just to kick it off, about what are some examples of toxic masculinity in sport. You've written a book about a lot of this stuff.
And Brennan, thank you. I mean, Luke, thank you, and happy Juneteenth, everyone. And I was afraid you were going to come to me first, so I think, and I tend not to use the word toxic, the term toxic masculinity, because I think it's unhelpful in the conversation with men generally. But I think that when we look at sports, it's very easy to see some of the toxic elements in sports, because sports is the place where the what we call toxic masculinity very often, it's where it still thrives. I say that sports doesn't have a masculinity problem. Masculinity has a sports problem. And that is that where most men live, masculinity as we kind of commonly know it, of being tough and strong and don't cry and don't back down, well, that's increasingly unacceptable. That's increasingly the toxicity of masculinity that we find unacceptable in society, but it's perfectly acceptable in sports. And so while you can have that kind of violent, tough masculinity in football and hockey and other sports where it's perfectly acceptable. If you watched a hockey game last night, I'm here in New York, and our Islanders, I'm on Long Island, our Islanders played last night, there were fights in that game. There was a violence in that game that was perfectly acceptable. And there was a full stadium of people who watched that privileged masculinity on the ice demonstrate those toxic elements in a way that we celebrate. And so part of what sports does is it perpetuates, because those are our heroes, right? Those are the icons of masculinity in our culture. The icons of being men in our culture are still in that space. And by extension, also part of that problem that sports has on masculinity. If you look at someone like Cam Newton, who definitely comes out and shows it, and I'm sure his name will be evoked many times in this conversation, if maybe, because he comes off in the way he dresses in a very non-traditional masculine way. If a middle school boy went to school that way, he would get his butt kicked in school, right? He would get teased, he would be harassed. And so what sports does for people like Cam Newton is it gives him a platform where he can expand what I refer to as narrow masculinity. He can expand an expression of himself, but he has the sports background that gives him permission and the platform to do that. That's exactly how I came to this work. I was asked by Jackson Katz and others more than a quarter century ago to use my privilege as an athlete to talk to other men about dismantling that which gives me privilege. And so I say that and offer that in this conversation around sport and masculinity, that we recognize that sport is a place where masculinity in its traditional sense still thrives, and that is a problem for men generally.
Okay, thank you. And just to make sure that we are kind of including all the concepts in the conversation that we need, Erica, I want to kick it to you with your background studying gender, and Paulette, you might want to chime in as well, about like, what is masculinity, and maybe like to specify it down a little bit, like how we see it in sport, but just kind of like defining masculinity and what that might look like in sport.
Okay, so masculinity, I think traditionally is a term that as things associated with men and acting man-like. To me, I would back that up and say one of the things that sports does is to create and sort of reinforce the idea that there are two genders that everybody fits into. So already ideas of masculinity help fit into that, but they also really complicate it because of the way athleticism itself is often associated with masculinity. So besides affecting athletes who compete in things designated male, it affects lots and lots of people in lots of different ways. I think partly because it often includes a sort of anti-effeminate thing, an anti-feminine thing, an anti-female thing, and also because it encourages certain kinds of behavior that I think is part of what Don was getting to. So as a person who writes about and is a practicing figure skater, one of the things I note there is same thing where you're not supposed to cry. And where also you're supposed to be, play when you're injured. And, I find myself being excited when I, accidentally dig my blade into my leg, but think, oh, maybe it's bleeding, but I'm going to keep going. I just think at many, many levels, these things kind of play out.
Okay, thank you. Paulette, do you have anything to add to that from kind of the study gender perspective? Yeah.
Yeah, I do think that this feeds into the way that like popular sports are negated in popular, like figure skating is different than football, right? Like we've decided what are the main sports that are okay to watch, and those are masculine. And I think that has, like, for example, I'm here in Phoenix, like the Phoenix Mercury is an amazing team, but the Suns have come back into fame, and like everyone's rallied the valley, like all the shirts are everywhere, but like we don't talk about the Phoenix Mercury, right? So like I think it does really feed into, and it's fed into the support for women's sports too. So like there's a way in which, like by creating, and that's where my area of expertise is, but like by creating these binaries, we've fed into the idea that there are some dominant sports, and they're mostly male sports, and they're football, baseball, basketball, and hockey. And like I know my experiences of growing up as a child, like I wanted to play baseball and I was terrible at it. And I'm also 4'11". So I was stuck like in rural Illinois swimming, which was crazy because I'm not built to be a swimmer, but that's what I did because that was what was available to me. And even now, like the corporatization of sport, to the point where I don't know if any of you have children, but to try to get your child into sport for like just fun, especially a male child, it's crazy. Like my son played soccer for so many years and he was not very great at it, and at some point like he was just kind of framed out of it because everyone was really competitive. So it's like sport as like antagonistic, and that actually comes from like Roman rhetoric. Pretty simple.
All right, and so now I'm going to drill down a little bit more specifically. Go for it.
Can I add on to that? I think what Paulette and Erica have said, that's really, really important to think about, is not understand sport only through American lens, right? So one of the things we have to understand about global sport is that global sports are connected to national sports, right? And so we have to understand how masculinity is best negotiated and strongly affirmed through national sports. And thus national sports vary. So that's why you see the level of toxicity within basketball, football, and baseball in the US does not take place with that same level of toxicness when you play basketball in India or when you play basketball in the UK. Whereas in the UK, playing soccer or cricket or rugby, which are seen as national sports, become the site of toxic masculinity. So we see how sport becomes a site to construct the national subject, which is understood as the national man, which is understood as the body that does work, That is the protector, that is fierce, that is strong. And so in that process, what it does is already imbue national sport as a site of exclusion. And so for it to be understood as national and to be it understood as sport, it needs to exclude various people. And that's where the realm of exclusion varies based on national context. So, as Don said earlier, while you see athletes, when I have studied, immigrants and refugees in the US and their take to basketball, the love of basketball, but yet because they have been gendered as not man enough in regards to white normative masculinity in sport or Black hyper masculinity in sport, what they have to do is then exclude women and queer masculinities in order to be legible as American men. That doesn't happen in other spaces. So there's something about national sport that creates a realm that really allows for toxic masculinity to seep out of all corners, becomes a governing logic.
Okay, and so that, yeah, just one second. I want to kick it to Chris real quick, because Stan, you mentioned kind of like different ways of performing masculinity and the exclusionary nature of it. And Chris, you had, I don't remember what year it was, but you had, you wrote a letter. It became very public, and you were trying to essentially work against the exclusion of queer communities in your sport, in football. And can you just tell us a little bit about kind of like what drove you to kind of speak out like that? And then also what you saw around you that did and didn't create an environment that could include more people in how to be masculine.
Right. And so I think the important thing that that all the panelists have touched on is that sport isn't just its own thing that stands separate from society. Sport is a reflection of parts of society. And so when we look at the history of human nature, it has been overwhelmingly patriarchal, right? It has been men who have been in control, men who have gone off to fight wars, men who have created games to simulate those wars. And so that is what has sort of made sports, for a long, long time, this traditionally masculine place. So I grew up playing soccer and baseball, eventually moved to football. And I was also a huge nerd at heart, which growing up playing sports in the 1980s, 1990s, not really a great place to be a nerd. So, kind of mirroring that same idea that there is this one accepted way to be an athlete, right? Which is what we've had for so long, where you're this hyper aggressive male, solving your problems through physical violence. And for a really long time, we have not valued the mental aspect of sports, right? And we view that as being weak. We view showing the emotional side as being weak, as that's not allowed in sports. And what we have to understand is that we are fighting against literally like thousands of years of history, that this has been ingrained in this culture. So it has to be a deliberate and conscious choice by everyone involved to say, no, what we did before was wrong. We are going to do this better moving forward. And so in my specific case, when I spoke out for LGBTQ rights, that was when bills against same-sex marriage were trying to be passed across the country. And I got involved to help prevent one of those bills in Minnesota, and essentially wrote a letter defending A, both same-sex rights, and then B, the idea that politicians should not be legislating people's sexuality. It's, if you're not harming someone else, then you should be free to live your life the way you want to live it. And as an athlete, you should be allowed to be who you are when you step out on the field. You shouldn't have to hide parts of yourself. And so, yeah, I think overall the discussion of toxic masculinity in sports is a smaller part of the discussion of toxic masculinity in culture as a whole. And that's really the big issue that we need to solve. Because if we solve that, then we solve it in sports too.
All right. And so Chris and Don, I want to drill down specifically into your experiences in like professional sports and like especially hyper masculine context of the NFL. What were, Chris, you referred to it as like parts of yourself that you can't express or something like that. What are some ways that you saw that kind of expression dampened or discouraged or something, if somebody's expression maybe seemed like it didn't quite fit the masculinity that was expected of people in the locker room or on the field or on the sideline, or whatever kind of context was there? What are some specific ways that you saw that expression just kind of get kind of discouraged?
Well, I think the most common one, and I'm sure it's one every male athlete has heard at one point if you try to throw something, is, oh, you throw like a girl, right? And so it's denigrating an entire gender to try to tell you not to do that. And so there's so many other ways you can make your point clear. Be like, no, lift your elbow higher, or you need to follow through faster. But instead it's, oh, you throw like a girl, or maybe it's a homophobic slur. Right. And so those instances still happen today on a daily basis. They happen in youth sports, they happen in high school sports, they happen in collegiate sports, they happen in professional sports. And so it's just a matter of understanding how divisive that kind of language can be, even though the person may not intend it to be. The fact that you're saying it implants and helps contribute to that atmosphere of toxic masculinity.
And Don, you mentioned Cam Newton. I'm thinking of like, well, okay, so from your experience in the NFL in those communities, do you think that he got flack when he kind of wore something like that the first time? Do you think that, but also thinking not just about him, but also about somebody who's not quite on his level of like fame and status, and like if someone does express themselves in a way that doesn't fit the mold of kind of the expected masculinity, what can that man expect to hear from his teammates, colleagues, maybe sportscasters or something like that?
I think it was Homer Simpson who said, "I'm not cool enough to wear pink." And if you can ball, if Cam Newton can play and he can win, he can wear whatever the heck he wants. And that's why I talk about the mask that sports allows, that privileged masculinity to express. I am here, I identify as a feminist, and thanks, Chris, for the book plug, because that's the title of my book, You Throw Like a Girl. That's what I was raised with. But I was, being a successful athlete, I was able to stretch that and be able to talk about that with confidence, be able to talk about not just my narrow masculinity, but my wholeness of masculinity publicly, because I had that athlete pedigree behind me that supported me expanding that understanding of masculinity. And I think one of the things that's really important in this discussion, in teasing out of, as Paulette talked about, the 4 sports that we celebrate, and Stan talked about American sports. I think it's really important if you're going to start talking about athletics, because everything that Paulette said about being an athlete, and Erica said about being an athlete, we want our girls to be tough and strong and don't quit, right? Those are good qualities, and men have appropriated those qualities to be part of our masculinity. And there is an Americanization of that. The resistance in the United States, and we can talk about the resistance as the LGBTQ community, as the trans community, women, people of color, the resistance in the United States right now, be very clear about, is cisgendered, heterosexual white men while holding onto an arcane view where they've co-opted things like power and control and even sport. And you have to look at where certain bodies have been co-opted to perpetuate that in terms of the wealth that has driven sport. But we also have to look at our institutions who continue to support some of the qualities that struggle that we're seeing still exists. In other words, you have 80%, 90% of athletes that you'll see in Power 5 schools playing on Saturday afternoons, in Power 5 conferences, making hundreds of millions of dollars for academic institutions, where a lot of those young white Black men can't matriculate if it were not for sport, where they're being used to support a multi-billion-dollar industry, but are not a part of the economic, are not reaping a part of the economic engine of that. And so in primarily in the ways of education, but also in the business of sport. So you have this also place where Black men's bodies, I mean, how do we live in a culture where Patrick Mahomes is worth $500 million at the same time that George Floyd was murdered in the way in which he was? How does that, I mean, if you talk about Stan from looking from a global perspective, the rest of the world is looking and saying, America, what are you all about? Which bodies do you value? Those that have a uniform, that entertain white culture, or those that don't?
Right. And if I can piggyback off that real quick, another case in point is probably the greatest athlete of this generation is almost never featured on television, and it's Simone Biles. she absolutely is crushing it right now. Like she is unbelievable at what she does. But if you go up and ask a random person on the street, they probably have no idea who she is.
Yep.
So.
Well, and I would say that has something to do, like white women also support, white cis women also support, like in fact do a lot more harm, not more harm than men, but I would say sometimes equally, because like that's one of the ways like the trans athlete bans are actually coming from white women. Like I spoke on a panel a couple of months ago, and there was a white woman who was carrying water for these ideas, and they come from, right, they get framed from toxic masculinity a bit, because it's this way that we're going to separate the sports, and they're co-opting Title IX, which is like a feminist vision for sports, to say that this doesn't protect trans people, and it affects, you know, it affects the way that like this throwing like a girl has said that like girls sports are bad and men's sports are good, and we like certain qualities. And this is why we get someone like Simone Biles, who's a woman of color, who is probably the greatest athlete right now, who cannot have a platform in the same way that somewhat like Colton Underwood or something gets on The Bachelor or right. I can't stop thinking about that lately. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the things brought up with this question that the various panelists have mentioned is we can't forget how toxic masculinity is also constructed, right? What the boundaries of that make white cisgender normative masculinity invisible, unmarked. And this is why the idea that Black men are hypermasculine or Asian men are emasculated and hypomasculine, and that Arab men are dangerous terrorists and hypermasculine, it comes with a silence, right? And so one of the things we have to think about sport is, how do we study masculinity in sport that doesn't continue to make whiteness invisible, to make it unmarked, right? And where we then play into the problem of seeing men of color as the problem, right? Which we see with the media circuits as well. And what that made me think of is also how we have to also refrain from seeing US mainstream sports as hyper masculine, right? If you look at football, baseball, and basketball, I mean, these are incredibly queer spaces, especially football, with the types of huddle, the quarterback receiving the ball from the center, the tackling. There are so many homoerotic readings and various types of possibilities there that have to be engaged with. And this is where toxic masculinity arises, because we have mainstream sport as a site to desire men, where men are asked to desire and take pleasure in the abilities of other men, but to contain it within the demands of heterosexuality and within the demands of a very heterosexist culture, is to make sure our desire is always turned back on itself as a point of identification rather than as a point of pleasure and desire, even though we're asked to desire these athletes, right? And that's something that, as we talk more about masculinity in sport, to think about, especially with Erica Rand's book, Red Nails, Black Skates, to think about how do desire and pleasure become such foundational structures of sport, but yet evacuated for the sake of maintaining the particular racial, gendered, and sexual, you know, hegemony that governs our sports.
All right, thank you for that. So I want to kind of I want to talk about the symptoms. I feel like we've talked a lot in such rich ways about some of the underlying issues, some of the kind of zoomed out ideas. What are some of the specific symptoms that we see of this larger kind of social disorder, we'll call it? So if toxic masculinity is the social disorder, what are the symptoms that we see in sport? And maybe ones that are less known, like a fight in hockey is somewhat easy to identify, and like that it's celebrated. But one example that I have, I don't play basketball very much, but I'm like 6'2", and so people ask me to, but I don't play very much. And so when I do decide to join a pickup game, I'm really rusty every time. one time I noticed that like I missed a wide open shot, and I had this kind of compulsion to just outwardly express so that everybody could hear that, like kind of like a dang it, or what's wrong with me today, or something like that. When really I knew what was wrong with my basketball game. It was that I hadn't played it for a year. So like I wasn't actually frustrated with myself. I expected myself to miss the shot, but I felt like I needed to perform that. I didn't live up to the expectation of what a man should do. A man should make the open shot if he's playing basketball, because that's what you do. And if you don't make it, you better express frustration so that the people around you, so that the men around you know that you are supposed to make that shot. And I didn't express that, but I had that compulsion to kind of like outwardly show them that like, I know I was supposed to make that. That was a bad shot, wasn't, like I didn't do it, but I felt compelled to. And so like that is like this really kind of pervasive symptom that I think that we see sometimes. What are some others? They don't have to be that kind of like nuanced, but what are some symptoms of this social disorder of toxic masculinity that we see when we're watching sports, that we do when we participate in them? Yeah, let's just talk symptoms.
I guess I'll go first to kind of piggyback off of Stan's earlier point about making whiteness visible, right? I think one of the most pervasive and most important things to recognize is who has the power, right? Who is the ownership group? Who are the coaches, right? Who are the people that actually make the decisions that matter? Because in most sports, if not all sports, the majority tend to be cis white men. Like that's who's making the decisions that count. And until that changes to more accurately represent the society that we live in, then it's going to be very hard to have that discussion, because no matter what we talk about, if the people in charge don't want to change, then nothing's going to change. Like that I would say is probably the most important thing in terms of recognizing what is really underlying here and showing this toxic masculinity. It's keeping the status quo that already exists.
And Chris, that status quo, you're exactly right in terms of the larger structural issues of sport as the business of sport. But there's a day-to-day way in which masculinity governs men's lives. And Luke, you were exactly right. I got asked to play golf with someone recently. I forget about football. I haven't watched a full NFL game in more than 18 years, and that's unacceptable to people who expect that I'm supposed to know everything about the game. I'm a college football geek, but I have no idea what happens in the NFL, and there's reasons for that. But I got asked to play golf, and that's not going out and showing my masculinity. If I slice the ball, if I hit the ball in the water, and hit the ball in the water a dozen times, I can't play golf. I don't like to play golf. But there's that pressure to deny who I am to fit into this place where it's a business relationship, or where it's I'm supposed to be that caricature of that athlete. And one of the problems, and I am someone who I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not an MD. I don't believe in CTE, chronic traumatic encephalitis, that is the brain injury, the regenerative brain injury, brain disease that comes from multiple concussions, that has been studied long. And I know Chris knows a tremendous about this. I don't believe that CTE is the reason that I have 33 guys at the time that I published my book 2 years ago, 33 guys that I knew through the game of football in college and professionally who were dead. 6 of them suicides that were featured in a film about CTE and the NFL. And I don't believe that all those guys were dead because of multiple concussions. I played until I was 29 years old. I played for 19 years, almost 20 years of my life, played football, had multiple concussions. And I just published a book. I think that what's bigger than even the part of brain injuries, because by the way, we like those. We like to see a guy get his bell rung. But part of it is also that these men live in this world of denying themselves. And this is where the conversation about masculinity is really important, about men denying themselves so they fit into this type of masculinity that is tough, that is strong, that is unfeeling, that we celebrate. Because those guys that I just told you who were made warriors on the field, that which made them warriors made them weak as men. They're incapable, their inability to say, I'm hurting, I'm struggling, I can't do this. Men dealing with divorce, men dealing with their loss of identity from no longer being an athlete, men dealing with financial problems and not having finished school until their ability to earn like they were earning when they were playing football. There's so many things that we don't address that's a part of that privileged masculinity that is lost. and that men struggle with, that impacts men who don't play sports. And so there's this conversation about men denying themselves the ability to live in their wholeness, to say, I'm struggling, I'm hurting, I'm vulnerable. That's part of what the symptom of this perpetuated by sport, excuse me.
Okay, great. And then before we move on to the second section, I do want to hear from Erica, Paulette, and Stan about this question, about what some of the symptoms are. And they can be symptoms for men, or they can be symptoms that trickle or that kind of like flow through toxic masculinity in men and affect other people. So yeah, I want to hear from you three about those symptoms. Someone can start. Whoever has something on the top of their mind.
Okay, I'll start. All right. So I think one of the things here to really pay attention to, and which we haven't said yet, is that masculinity is a relational concept, a relational category, meaning masculinity doesn't exist by itself. It's always in relation to something, right? And femininity as the opposite of masculinity, and then queer masculinities and trans masculinities as the opposition to heterosexual masculinity. So what we see as the symptoms is the way in which we understand masculinity as a social practice being so deeply attached to only certain bodies, right? And by being so deeply attached to certain bodies, naturalizing it is something men do, instead of really allowing us to deliberate on masculinity as a social practice of certain types of, strength, or certain types of bodily ability, and all of this stuff that has to be much more expansive, not only for men by men, but rather masculinity as something we do in a much larger social world. And if we don't get to that, then we fall into the symptoms where we understood masculinity as a practice that only men do, right? And thus we don't see the ways in which it reaches and bleeds in and out of so many communities.
I would add the way that it also perpetuates hero worship. I mean, I come from, and I've written a lot about the running world. There's been a lot about having to like think more about female runners, because in a lot of ways we've talked about male runners, and specifically like in the world of ultra running, which is it's newer. It's where people run past the marathon distance. As the sport started coming up, they literally didn't have the prize structure to pay women equally. They definitely didn't have equal sponsorship money in almost any fashion. And the sport was coming up in like the early 2000s, was gaining fame. And the heroes that we worshiped were like these 5 male athletes, and they were multiple documentaries, and it became like this whole fan structure too, to the point where you'd show up at an ultra running race and like one of these guys would show up, because they didn't separate the amateur from the professional runners, and it was this whole fan worship, and they've got the New Balance, we need this New Balance. And so I would imagine, like, football players know this from fantasy football, it has to be kind of horrifying to play football and be somebody's fantasy player that week and have done a bad job that week or not played as well, because it's the same. I think we found it the same way in the running world, is that the fan culture like feeds into the hypermasculinity, and it becomes kind of this feedback loop where it's a whole other like chess game to follow the athletes and then follow them on social media. And I think it's fed into that sort of toxic culture as well.
All right, thank you, Erica.
And I've just been thinking about a few things, picking up partly on Stan's question about who authentically has masculinity or can have masculinity. So one thing, of course, is that contributes to policing, especially Black and brown women, especially of the global South, who have athleticism that is not considered properly female. But I also think of Don, you throw like a girl point, and Paulette, when you mentioned Colton Underwood, because One thing, I teach queer and trans sports studies, and one of the things I always start with is a contest from Bachelor Pad, synchronized swimming of, quote, the guys against the girls. And part of the point is to make fun of guys doing synchronized swimming. But of course, they turn out to be much more athletic and much better at it than women who were not really coming from some kind of sports training. And the thing to me about the "you throw like a girl" expression is that says something bad about huge volumes of people, but also sometimes refers to people in those categories not getting training to, put their weight into the throw. So that question of how those ideas perpetuate problems in training and insufficient training and things like that for people being trained as girls and women is another sort of direction of things happening.
Erica, you mentioned that, and I used to, back when I was a little bit more active in my life, I used to do camps for kids. And girls would always, throwing a football is different than throwing any other kind of ball. Throwing a football is, the motion of the hand is unnatural. And so it has to be taught. And boys just think that they inherently know because they have a penis that they know how to throw a football, right? And they know the characters. I'm Joe Montana, right? I'm Warren Moon, right? And so they know how to mimic the sort of that performance, but they don't know how to throw the ball technically. And the girls would listen. And in fact, girls versus boys, the girls would actually, when taught, would throw better than the boys because the girls would listen and do it the way that it's taught, as opposed to the way that it's imagined.
All right, so that's a great segue into
just to support that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can I just make one
Sure.
really quick point about one of the symptoms? And I think one of the symptoms when we move from the professional realm to the realm of college and high school and middle school sports is the ways in which we have structured it so much around data analytics, win-loss records, and ideas of dominance that we cannot imagine sport as a site of pleasure and affirmation. Rather, it becomes a site of violence, right? And so I think some of those symptoms of that masculinity that we understand is this realm of a very Western, European, American-centered language of the conquest and of the pioneer and this and that leads to such violence at the collegiate and high school and middle school levels, where, as Don said, these young men cannot and young women cannot talk about their mental health because that is the symptom of our amateur sports.
Great point. Great point. All right, so we're going to take a turn toward kind of a more hopeful, promising future. And so in that vein, I just want to ask, what would non-toxic masculinity, if we could just say masculinity without kind of the connotation, I guess, of it inherently having some toxicity, describe what non-toxic masculinity in sport would look like. So remove the toxicity. I know that we could write a dissertation about how to do that, but remove the toxicity, focus only on kind of positive, neutral characteristics that are associated with masculinity. And yeah, what would that look like? What would that look like at the youth level, at the collegiate level, at the pro level? What would watching it look like? And then I also want to acknowledge that there might be models out there elsewhere in the world that we don't know about that are actually good models to see this in. So basically just imagine or draw our attention to what non-toxic masculinity in sport would look like.
Go ahead. I don't want to.
Oh, well, I was going to say, I think the inherent problem is that sports as a whole, generally, I mean, in most sports, you're competing against someone else, right? There's a winner and a loser, and you have to compare yourself against someone else. And I think that kind of helps lead into the idea of toxic masculinity, because toxic masculinity is you're defining yourself against someone else in a negative light. Whereas if we were to look at sports as a positive masculinity place, really the only person you should be competing against is yourself, right? Did I play to the very best of my ability when I was out there on the field? The result doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, someone might be faster than me, someone might be stronger than me, or I might have been the fastest player out there on the field that day, whatever. The point is, you can only control what you do. So if you're only ever competing against yourself, then I think we can kind of move away from this idea that in order for me to be good, someone else has to be bad, right?
And that's the proposition of sport. I mean, I think sometimes we get away from it. Sport is an I win, you lose proposition, right? I mean, that's why we do it. And I'll tell you, as someone who identifies as a feminist and been doing this work, is that I still like that. I don't watch sport. I don't watch a lot of sport, but I still like that. I still like to go out and compete. I would say that I'm an athlete in recovery, because I still like to compete. Let's get at it, right? Even in argument, even rhetorically, it is a competition of thoughts and ideas. And I think one of the things that I talk about is not non-toxic masculinity, because those elements of sport are part of the definition of toxic masculinity. What is aspirational masculinity? What do we want for each other? Because part of what toxic masculinity says is take away. That's why there's insults. You throw like a girl. That's why we say that we don't raise boys to be men. We raise boys not to be women. And so therefore we have to make those toxic elements important and give them merit. Where what we should be thinking about is, what do we want in our wholeness? And I talk about being aspirational masculinity as being loving and caring, passive and submissive and empathetic. And I had someone actually say, well, you can't say being a man is being passive and submissive and empathetic. I'm like, I just taught my 16-year-old daughter how to drive. You want to talk about being passive and submissive and vulnerable? That's right. I mean, you have to sit there and just let her explore this 2-ton vehicle, right? And so it is a part of our wholeness as men to be seeking that aspirational masculinity that allows us to live in our authentic wholeness. And sport doesn't ask for that.
Although, this just reminds me of this. So Pat Griffin, a big activist for LGBTQ sports equity, wrote this amazing piece in this volume, Sports Dykes, from the 80s, where she had, it's just this great story about how she comes from Tennessee and she moves to Western Massachusetts, where there are all these lesbians all over the place. And she's, lonely, and she finally finds a team, or she finds lesbian softball, which, it's not a new idea to share with you all. Anyway, so she goes to and thinks she finally has found this group. And then she finds that like all the teams are trying not to compete with each other. Like, oh yeah, we don't compete. But, as she sort of gets the lay of the land and discovers she should, not bring the meat casserole or whatever, it does turn out that there's a certain competitive spirit among the players and the teams. And I think sort of figuring out how to find that balance between what might be enthusiasm for competition and at the same time to do that with other kinds of values involved, like what does it mean to lose or win, and who do you have to step over to do it, and where would cooperation happen? That might be some, and what it would be like to not humiliate people who lose stuff.
Right.
Almost like when you give a handshake, whether you win or lose at the end of the game, and taking that mentality and expanding it to the way that we think about competition in general. That's kind of what I've heard from you, Don and Eric, a little bit, is like that balance of like, I want to win, I want to compete, but if I don't win, then I can be okay with myself and the other person, and I can move on, and I can kind of, like it is striking that balance, is taking the post-game handshake and expanding it to, the whole scope of competing, the whole scope of sport, I guess.
And I will say one thing about that, Luke, that I think is important. It's I used to always say that I learned to be tough playing football, but I learned not to stiff arm my sister to get to the dinner table. Right. So there has to be the socialization process that takes place that says that these are the things that you do in the context of sport, but they're not acceptable socially. And I do think that one of the significant things that's happened very recently, as I said, I don't watch NFL, but I saw all the everyone to do about the 3 black coaches for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers who won the Super Bowl. The 3 black coaches, like they got the opportunity in a league that's 80% black on the field. These black guys got the opportunity to coach the 80%. And most of those guys actually played in the game, so no big accomplishment. It's just the fact that white men allowed them to have that job. But what was more significant about Tampa Bay was that they had 2 women coaches on that staff, which should tell you that this is a generation of young boys who are comfortable with women's leadership, especially in the hypermasculine sport of football. you don't win the Super Bowl unless you have all oars in the water rowing the same way. And so if you have 2 women on that staff, that means you have a culture that accepted those women as equals, accepted those women in their leadership and their acumen for the game. To me, that was more significant than the 3 Black coordinators for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is that they had women on that staff and that those players responded to women's leadership.
And you touched on you mentioned like younger players, or the younger generation is okay with it, is kind of embracing it. What are some ways that you either see actual progress in kind of the topic of masculinity in sport, or that you see the potential for it among kind of younger generations of athletes coming up? Like what do you think is going to be better, and who is leading that charge?
Well, for me, I don't see this as a generational thing, right? Like that, I think that would be too easy to say. The further we get along, the newer generation will always make things better. Then, the run from 2016 to 2020 in U.S. politics would clearly say that's not the case, right? And I think one of the things we see is that's different is something of the children of the young people that grew up in the 60s and 70s, and what they're using to teach their kids, and what those kids are now teaching to their kids, right? And how they're reframing an idea of equity, right? And I think that's where, I think now we're coming at a point where the next generation is probably going to be a generation that could actually pull back the pendulum of progress. Look at all the attacks against critical theory, attacks against feminist theory, attacks against critical race theory, right? And so we are living in a time where, in order for us to engage with masculinity in sport and its violent realms, we have to be able to create spaces where athletes, coaches, administrators, and corporate players talk about the exploitation of sport that impacts women and men and trans women in very different ways, right? And how that leads to various politics of exclusion. And to then think about what are those spaces where there is joy and pleasure, right? Because I'm not, by no means do I think we should do away with winning and losing. But when is winning and losing so bent and constructed through exploitation that it leads to these practices of violence in sport, right? And so for me, one of the things that offer me hope is the All-Star game. And people would say, why the heck would he be so excited about the All-Star game? If you look at baseball, basketball, or football, the All-Star games are incredible because it's one of the only spaces where athletes get to be the spectators of themselves. And it's one of the spaces where they cheer for their peers, right, who are on opposite teams, and they want to see excellence at its best, right? There's something so profoundly powerful about the structuring of all-star games that I would love for that to play out in amateur realms too, where you have a site where players can take joy and appraise each other rather than, work through these realms of, I must have the win at all consequences, right?
Well, I think a lot of that comes from the coaching that they get, and it starts at a very young age. I mean, if you have a coach that teaches you the only thing that's important is winning and losing, then that's what you're going to value growing up. I've been coaching my daughters in AYSO soccer for the past 4 years now, and I see so many coaches out there on the field with like 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and they're like, kick it in the net, score, we got to win. I'm like, these kids are 9. Like, who cares? Like, let's teach them the fundamentals of the game and make it fun, so that way they want to come back and play again next year. Like, I could care less if we win or lose the game. All I care about is, did you learn something and did you have fun out there? But I mean, that comes from a leadership perspective. That comes from a coaching perspective. And a coach that doesn't do that, well, the player's not going to learn it, because that knowledge isn't just going to spring fully formed into their brain. They have to be taught that knowledge.
And a lot of the anti-trans legislation happening now is absolutely not recognizing that a lot of the point of sport for most young people is not about making it to some professional level, right? So trying to judge people of like that, are they going to win, rather than what else could you get out of sport that all people, including trans and non-binary people, should have.
So
Yeah, I think transforming sports where it's, I mean, because that's how I came to it. It's about belonging, it's about fitness, it's about play and pleasure and fun. Transforming sports to where it's this experience where it is about belonging has to be at the center of this, and it can still be about competitiveness as well. Like you can compete and do that. But Chris, you were talking about your experience with your daughters in soccer. Like I've had really bad experiences with my son in soccer because he's not awesome, but he liked it. And he just kind of got pushed out by a culture with parents who are pushing their kids to succeed and really not acknowledging their privilege. We live in a affluent area in Arizona, and they're buying their way into they're trying to buy their kids into a scholarship, right? And that seems to negate that. So it seems like if we could create a culture of belonging where people can understand and check their privileges, and it can be this is an overuse of the word, but it can really be a safe space, because sports can be a positive mental health thing, right? Like I've learned this in COVID. Like, I'm having a bad day. If I take myself out for a run, like I'm better. I'm a better person. And, some people it's playing a game of pickup basketball or whatever, and chatting with a friend. And even for me, like I'm also like super competitive. So I was at a workout class last night, and the guy next to me was on the treadmill going faster. And I was like, well, if you're going to go 9, I'm going to go 10, because we're going to do this, and that's just like in me to compete, and that's great, and that made me feel great about myself because I beat him, happy to say, which is actually a really interesting experience for women in sports. Like I actually finished this 100-mile race. This is a funny story, so I'm going to get into it for about 2 seconds. But a 100-mile race through the mountains in Los Angeles, it took me just under 24 hours. And the end of the race, like you're racing among people the whole time, and I was first female, and I was like 5th or 6th, and coming into the finish chute, you get overcome with emotions, right? You're not thinking about like, is there a guy right behind me? Because you've been racing for 23 hours and 30 minutes. Well, a guy couldn't stand that a girl was going to beat him. So he ran past me in the last like 20 yards. And it was like really one of those experiences where afterwards I didn't talk to him, but I probably should have. I wanted to be like, what was going on with you? Like, what happened there? But it was like his psyche, like what's going on with him that he needed to run past me, as opposed to like, I don't know, we could hold hands or we could have a conversation. But it was that made that experience like a little bit sour for me.
all right, so we are
Hey, Luke, can I just
do you want to close us out? That's what we need at this point. Do you want to close us out with something?
I really want to close this out, but can I have a final thought, and then
Sure, we'll call it a final thought.
And I'll be very, very, very brief. I think one of the things that we tend to do with this conversation around masculinity in sport is to see that sport in our culture was designed, and many people do, not talking about people on this call, but it was designed to do something more than what it was intended to do. Sport is play. And we've co-opted it for a multitude of reasons. I remember having a mother say to me once that her son wasn't good enough to play. And I said, how old is he? He said he's 8. I'm like, that doesn't compute with me. There's no such thing as being not good enough to play. And so we've tried to we've made it into something. And in this conversation, we have co-opted this role of sport to uphold the kind of narrow masculinity that we think of the iconic men in our culture that represent, and the men's sports that represents in this place for masculinity to thrive. And one of the things I say that in order for men to truly start to move into our wholeness is what we have to remove chivalry, the proposed understanding of chivalry, from our ideas men as being protectors and providers. And even in this conversation around expanding the conversation around masculinity in sport. And we have to remove that burden of chivalry, because if my job as a man is to be the protector and the provider, then don't mess with my violent masculinity. I'm going to need it to protect my people, my woman, right? My community, whatever that is. So we have to remove that from the conversation so that men can truly look at ourselves in our authentic wholeness, so that we're not trying to fit this square peg into a round hole, but that we're truly living in our authentic wholeness in the breadth of our human identity, and not just confined to how do we navigate masculinity within the context
It's 12 o'clock.
of any social issue.
So
Yeah,
thank you.
I would love to offer a final closing thought if if there's space for that. But just to think about, like, what are these positive realms of masculinity? How do we detoxify it or whatever? I think the WNBA and what they did last year and the last 4 or 5 years is a very clear site to think about how does female masculinity and athletic femininity, with a commitment to justice in the wholest and broadest terms, create worlds we can all live in. So for me, what WNBA activism has done, and their fierceness, their leadership, and being ballers and shot callers, that's what they've done, right? It's in the most expansive realm. So for me, I think that is a vision of what we can do to think about detoxifying sports in the broadest way. And that means Black Lives Matter, trans lives matter, and say no to anti-Asian racism, no to Muslim bans, no to border children in cages, no to indigenous dispossession, and saying we're here to create our tomorrow on the most just terms.
Thank you. Those are a couple great final thoughts. Just to close this out before I kick it back to Kendall, I just want to express appreciation to all of you for all of your insights. I really love how we kind of shuttled back and forth between the general social theoretical and then the kind of specific manifestations and symptoms and things like that. I think it was a really helpful discussion to kind of understand things from taking a step back and then taking a step forward and really looking at it closely at how we see it in everyday life. So thank you all to all of our panelists, and Kendall, I will kick it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I absolutely loved this discussion. There's so much more to be said. As with our GSM lives, we always find ourselves, closing down, but it really just is the beginning of these conversations. So again, in the chat box, we have just a few more things for our audience here. If you can just stick around, we are dropping more details. Please do check out our wider issue for the month of June, Beyond the Binary in Sport. And if you have a few more minutes, we do have a video from our Global Sport Institute, which just kind of expands on this academic theme of sex, gender, and sexuality in sport, which we would like to play for you now. So with that, Brendan, if you wouldn't mind playing that video for us.
Research Institute. We organize ourselves around a different theme each year. Our current theme is sex, gender, and sexuality in sport. We started this Sea Grant program for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted to engage the campus. So we wanted to have that expanded research that we can draw from as an institute, but also disseminate to the world. We wanted to encourage scholars who hadn't studied sport before to study sport. So it's far deeper than any one research lab can do. We can call upon scholars in our university and in global partners to speak upon those critical issues that we all need to look at.
We want to push the envelope. We want to think in ways we've never thought before. Engineering, health and nutrition, social sciences, humanities, art, fashion, history, and so much more.
We invite those who are interested to not only look at the current theme year, but to go back, to look at the future of sport and what might be going on now, to look at race and sport around the globe, to look at sport in the body. We're pulling them all together and hoping to create greater intersectionality, deeper understanding of the world of sport. In our 3 years, we have given over $1.1 million in awards to over 50 Sea Grant awardees. Here are our Sea grantees for our theme, sex, gender, and sexuality in sport.
In this study, we explore the many ways trans and gender nonconforming, or TGNC, athletes story their sense of gender in the context of sport organizing.
We plan on recruiting 20 to 30 self-identified TGNC athletes and collect stories about these athletes' experiences of belonging and empowerment in sport contexts.
Our project focuses on the use of non-invasive brain stimulation as a means to enhance motor performance. and how the effect may differ between males and females.
I'm mostly interested in wrist-worn wearables, and the technology I'm developing for this project combines camera and motion sensors in a unique way to get at data that we've never had access before in sports performance.
The project I'm working on is 50 interviews, video interviews, and still portraits of 50 women, girls, and trans men who have had the experience of playing on an all-boys team. People who have been the only girl on the team.
Sport is beautiful and uniting. In motor control research, we see how in sports, the brain and the body unites beautifully to achieve performance. In the bigger picture, sport also unites different people and different minds.
The purpose of my research is to understand the impact of indoor lighting environment on physical training performance, focusing on the sex difference, and to develop an optimum lighting prediction model through human physiological signals so that the sex-specific training environment can be established.
We're going to be looking at how participation in recreational sport activities can shape and then hopefully empower individuals' views and perceptions of their own gender, body image, and sexuality.
We're hoping to take a look at the history of sport over time and look at the ways that different populations were either included or excluded from sport, from women to people of color to LGBTQ folks, and now of course trans youth, and see how the same logic and same rhetoric was used to either deny or accept people into the sport arena at any level, whether that's a rec league, a professional league, a K-12 setting.
I've been able to continue with the research side of my interest in roller derby. I think it has just so much to share with us about how sex, gender, and sexuality in an amateur sport and a DIY sport has had a different ability to investigate itself, grow, and incorporate athletes who haven't always found a home in other sports. So I'm interested in telling the story of race, gender, class, age, all of the ways that sports have meaning in American culture through the lens of roller derby and its long history in book form.
One important research goal in our lab is to understand neuromuscular mechanisms during various physical activities and translate this knowledge to the design of wearable devices that can help maximize performance and minimize risk of injury during various sports activities.
The long-term purpose of this project is to address the current wave of exclusionary sports policies and practices aimed at youth who live beyond or who challenge the limits of the gender binary.
I'm excited to expand my work on the culture industry into the sports sector and to capture the experiences of Black women across the gender spectrum throughout various aspects of the sports industry.
In this project, we will be looking at gender differences both within the athletic community and the military veteran community as it relates to injury outcomes.
Design sport goods. We manufacture protective equipment, for example, some foam and helmet structures, so that it will prevent the athletes from impact.
My passion is the development and deployment of technologies from the lab into the real world. We focus on improving scientific knowledge of fitness for sports in transgendered individuals.
I plan to doing research in the knee brace manufacturing. A well-designed knee brace may be able to reduce this possibility by reducing the strain at ACL and limit the rotation motion in the knee.
Our goal is to look at the stories of transgender individuals and their experience with sport, how it impacted their lives, whether or not they were able to play or unable to play, and how that intersects with their transgender identity.
We're interested in looking at people that they consume smaller amount of water compared to the dietary guidelines.
We plan to continue our research in the field of soft robotic wearable devices and study how we could reduce sport-related injuries using this technology. On the other hand, we will also collaborate with our medical partners to study how we could use this as a rehabilitation device to help with patients with neurological impairments.
Follow the work of our C Grant awardees and the Global Sport Lab. There are countless conversations to be had around sex, gender, and sexuality in sport.
Understanding
sport matters. So as we continue to explore through research and these conversations through storytelling, both on our Global Sport Institute site and through Global Sport Matters, we invite you all to continue engaging with us. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we will see you next time right here at Global Sport Matters Live.